On any battlefield, there is one force feared beyond any other. That force is surprise. An ambush by a weapon. A tactic never before seen. Developed in secret, employed in secret, and now ready to devastate in ways not yet known. Secret weapons. On this episode, Hide and Seek.
For Secret Weapons, John Palmer.
Any one of the operators of these all-seeing displays on an Aegis cruiser can direct a battle better than Napoleon or Lord Nelson ever could. This dazzling combat information center embodies the ingenious secret weapons development that have gone into the old game of hide and seek. The warrior's eyes may now electronically turn darkness into midday, or even whirl thousands of miles above the earth. An artilleryman might find and destroy a concealed enemy gun by electronically tracking its invisible supersonic shells backward to their firing place. A warrior who once thought himself lucky to be able to find a scrub tree to hide beneath may now lie hidden beneath oceans that would submerge even the Empire State Building. But the weapons geniuses are tracking even him.
Up through World War II and Korea to the fighting in Vietnam, soldiers and airmen had their heads on a swivel, searching the jungle or the skies to spot the enemy first and gain that split-second edge that might mean victory, even survival. In the Persian Gulf War, all the heads were locked in place over electronic displays. The secret weapons designers had almost totally replaced the human eye with cathode ray tubes and high-energy beams. The story of how one modern army sustained tens of thousands of casualties defending heavily dug-in positions, while the other lost barely 100 in the course of making a headlong assault over alarmingly open country, can be explained in two words that any child knows: hide and seek. For one side in the Desert War, secret weapons made night a friend. Camouflage, no mystery. Bad weather, no inconvenience. For the other side, the nightmare began at dusk when stealth fighters took to the air and vanished, not only to the human eye, but to the electronic eyes that searched for them. The F-117's electronic systems made no emissions that an enemy could read. Its radar-thwarting skin and shape diffused the searching beams. Its shielded exhausts frustrated infrared targeters. The enormous weight of anti-aircraft weapons around Baghdad could only fire as blindly as they might have during World War I. Opposing gunners were thwarted even when visibility was unlimited. Electronic jammers like the Air Force EF-111A and the Navy's EA-6B Prowler carried secret pods to confound the enemy's radar defenses. They amplified, diminished, and misplaced enemy radar waves. A single EF-111A can protect an entire friendly formation. It can not only jam the enemy's SAM radars and radio communications on the ground, but also confuse the equipment in his airborne interceptors, creating a corridor in the sky in which attacking friendly aircraft become electronically invisible. The secret weapons designers were zeroing in on enemy radars and radios even when they were allowed to operate. Radio wave interceptor units in aircraft like the electronic countermeasure version of the Black Hawk helicopter employed direction finders to locate the radars and the weapons they were directing. and to be located was to be annihilated. The brief war in the Persian Gulf was the last act of a game of hide and seek that had begun many years before.
Beyond question, radar, the acronym for radio detection and ranging, was the master seeing weapon. The principle of transmitting a radio wave and reading the return image on a cathode ray tube was so perfectly conceived that it has changed little to this day. But the crude equipment in use when World War II began was sadly limited. Huge, fixed, unhideable towers stood vulnerable to air attack. Indeed, the German Stukas struck Britain's radar savagely. Then, in 1940, two British weapons scientists, J.T. Randall and H.A. Booth, produced the cavity magnetron, a device no bigger than a man's fist that was the greatest single breakthrough in intelligence warfare. The magnetron generated high-power microwave pulses that permitted the development of the first compact weapons radar.
Airplanes and small ships had their eyes extended by hundreds of miles, and 1,000 U-boats were doomed. Now the hide and seek would move to Europe's skies. The hide-and-seek contest of both Luftwaffe and RAF night bombers against navigational difficulties and enemy defenses resulted in an epic duel of secret weapons designers. The German inventors solved the problems of locating nighttime targets in Europe's bad weather with a radio beam system they called Knickerbein, or dog-leg. With the vast expanse of the European continent in their hands, the Germans were able to widely separate two radio beams that crisscrossed the target. The bombers would intercept and fly along one of the beams, hearing a continuous tone when on course, dots when drifting to port, and dashes when drifting to starboard. At the beam's intersection, an audio signal triggered bombs to within 400 yards of the target. The British soon had their own version, called Oboe. As their bombers began to pound the Reich, the Germans sought new ways to intercept the night raiders that were savaging their cities. German scientists set up the world's first full electronic defensive net. Powerful ground radars picked up the incoming bombers when they crossed the coast, tracked them across the continent, and projected likely destinations. A radio matrix alerted fighter bases in the line to the target, so the bomber stream would be under constant attack by fresh waves of German fighters all the way in and back. Smaller radar sets enabled the German night fighters to target individual bombers in the formation. German anti-aircraft guns received radar information on the bomber's altitude, and entire batteries were aimed by the beams. The Nazi success was so complete that the British secret weapons experts had to respond. One answer was aluminum foil strips cut to the likely wavelength of the probing enemy radar. Called window or chaff by the Americans, it was unleashed by bombers in huge clouds and took away all the discrimination power from the enemy radar beams. Now the Germans couldn't tell a large formation from a single plane, and aircraft direction and altitude could not be accurately determined. But increasingly powerful airborne radars deployed in specially designed night fighters like the P-61 Black Widow would have the upper hand by the time World War II ended. Now the Cold War began. Design genius Kelly Johnson was hard at work with a top-secret team known collectively as the Skunk Works. They found ways to uncover the huge, hostile, forbidden expanses of the Soviet Union from border to border. Marrying modern jet engine and glider technology, Johnson achieved the U-2. an airplane that could fly 3,700 miles at 70,000 feet, too high to see, to hit with anti-aircraft artillery, or to intercept with the fighters then available. When a Soviet surface-to-air missile downed a U-2 4 years later, Skunk Works designed the higher and faster SR-71 Blackbird. It cruised at 80,000 feet and reached speeds of Mach 3. No plane ever flew so many missions over hostile territory without interception. Cameras could now look down from the edge of space, and there was a way to make the heavenly eye even sharper.
By World War I, the science of camouflage flourished. Blending colors, blending edges, and painting dazzle patterns became highly successful military weapons. In countering such camouflage, the design labs made infrared almost as important as radar. It works like this. Every object absorbs infrared waves, increasing its temperature. Each object emits its own particular heat pattern called an IR signature. Special imaging equipment and film can read the signature temperatures as differing colors or brightness. So natural vegetation becomes identifiable from painted camouflage, people from structures, even tanks from trucks. Night, clouds, and fogs disappear for the viewer of infrared. Carefully hidden enemies become clearly seen.
The super cameras of the high-flying planes contain more than infrared scanning. Computer-ground high-resolution lenses couple with computerized motion compensators to fight blurring. Rotating shutters deliver flawless overlaps of images. People can be clearly seen from 70,000 feet. On a high-altitude mission, a U-2's 450-pound camera covered a swath 745 miles wide. Each frame was shot in duplicate by a second camera 84 degrees removed from the first, making the 3D images more accessible to photo interpretation.
The photo analysts are the secret heroes. They have spotted such things as Russian units in Afghanistan decontaminating their vehicles in a procedure suggesting they were training in chemical warfare.
The discovery of nuclear-capable missiles put into Cuba by the Soviets in 1962 gained the high flyers their biggest reputation. Faced with photographic proof of the secret arming, the United States forced the Soviets to withdraw the deadly weapons. A single spy plane had defeated an entire nuclear missile battery. Another would defuse a nuclear war. Some air intelligence weapons do their work with sensors and cameras instead of guns and missiles. In October 1973, an SR-71 Blackbird raced to avoid nuclear Armageddon. Midway through the Arab-Israeli war, the 2,000-mile-per-hour plane utilized mid-air refueling to fly from Florida to Israel and back non-stop. Its scanners, optical cameras, and infrared equipment confirmed that the Israelis were prepared to arm their Jericho missiles with nuclear warheads for use against the Arabs if they broke through. With such use certain to involve the superpowers dangerously, the American president used a hotline to alert the Soviets. Moscow instantly shipped warheads to Egypt to achieve an area weapons balance that, in the event of a nuclear exchange, would leave the Americans and the Russians out of it. The Egyptian breakthrough never came, so the little nuclear war, and perhaps a bigger one, was averted thanks largely to the work of the SR-71. Over the years, the bearing of airborne intelligence on politics and peace has been substantial. Eventually, the all-seeing eyes of a network of Earth-orbiting satellites replace the high flyers. Powered-down satellites are now in orbit posing as space junk, waiting to be activated in case of war. The master secret weapons that tie all the others together are radar surveillance planes like the AWACS, an acronym for Airborne Warning and Control. From 30,000 feet, the AWACS rotating radar searches the Earth 275 miles around and the sky in a 300-mile circle. As few as 3 high-flying AWACS could form an overlapping surveillance of enemy deployments from England to Czechoslovakia and from Norway to Italy. On board the AWACS, operators at 9 consoles observe Earth, sea, and sky in as many as 24 different surveillance modes. They track dozens of targets, recording altitude, speeds, headings, and weapons types. Information gathered is fed to all friendly weapons units, flashing it on display screens for coordinated attack by all. Because modern war doesn't stop when the sun goes down, the infantry soldier got his crack at the trillion-dollar high-tech arsenal to turn him into a nocturnal creature. The battery-powered starlight scope concentrates the merest flicker of light, even the stars, up to 40,000 times. In the darkest night, there is light enough to see without projected beams that might give away a soldier's position. Even more portable are thermal imaging glasses. Unlike the starlight scope, they can penetrate rain, fog, and smoke, as well as darkness. Suddenly, the enemy no longer gets the night off. But not all the eyes are human. Always outnumbered in its wars, Israel sought ways to obtain detailed intelligence without risking personnel or high-cost aircraft. Freely borrowing development technology from friendly powers, the Israeli designers experimented carefully with drones. A sophisticated drone may be fired by a rocket booster from a light truck. Then a turbojet engine takes over. The drone flies a pre-programmed flight path with infrared sensors and cameras turned on by a timer. A radio link back to the base site transmits instant data. The drone then flies back to the base and parachutes down with its film cassette.
Some of the most brilliant uses of hide-and-seek weapons in half a century was accomplished by the Israelis against powerful Syrian forces during the Lebanon incursion of 1982. The Bekaa Valley bristled with state-of-the-art Soviet surface-to-air missiles that threatened the low-level air support so vital to Israeli success. Neutralizing the SAMs began with inspired use of RPVs, or remote pilotless vehicles.
The Israelis used the tiny sensor-packed craft to chart Syrian air defense sites. Other drones were launched to draw radar illumination by Syrian SAM batteries. When the enemy radar lit up, anti-radiation missiles rode down the beam to blow it away.
The deadly hide-and-seek went on from there. Once Syrian fighters were airborne, the Israelis used lurking E-2C Hawkeyes to jam their frequencies and cut them off from ground direction, while their own well-directed fighters slaughtered them. The final score was 86 Syrian aircraft and 19 radar sites destroyed, for the loss of 3 Israeli planes.
Mast-mounted sight systems on modern helicopters seem like something out of a Space Invaders movie. The relatively vulnerable chopper can hover behind an obstruction while its radar and infrared systems illuminate the target with a laser designator. Then laser-guided weapons held on target by the beam of the mast-mounted sight finish the job. The motto of today's battlefield is, if you can see it, you can kill it. That's a big incentive for the secret weapons geniuses to keep getting better at both hide and seek.
As formidable as secret hide-and-seek weapons are in deciding battles, they are just as good at preventing them. In the wake of the Eastern Bloc's breakup and the Gulf War, the ever-vigilant, all-seeing electronic eyes check the disposition and movements of the weaponry of all camps. Even in the age of push-button attack, there are steps in preparation that cannot be hidden. So long as future surprise attackers know that the seeking eyes of the electronics that served so brilliantly in the Gulf War are aiming annihilating munitions at them, the world can breathe a lot easier. For Secret Weapons, I'm John Palmer.